Welcome everyone to the Collaborative Mentoring webinar series. Today we'll be talking about running a strategy-led organization. Strategy is both critical and often elusive for nonprofits. In our quest to develop effective organizations that serve our stakeholders, we often find ourselves in challenging situations, trying to determine which direction to go. This webinar will provide a basic framework of how to run a strategy-led organization to help navigate decision-making, align day-to-day activities, and improve outcomes. We'll discuss how strategy is used, how to develop organizational strategy and ownership, and how to operationalize strategy. Experts Bob Tipton and Cary Brown will provide specific examples of processes and tools that can be used to shape and implement strategy in your own program. Thank you all for joining us today. This webinar is part of the Collaborative Mentoring webinar series, which is funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention through the National Mentoring Resource Center and facilitated in partnership with Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. These webinars would not be possible without the planning team, which includes the mentoring partnerships shown on this slide. In addition to this webinar series, the NMRC provides resources for mentoring practitioners. At the end of this webinar, we'll provide more details about how you can access this free support. Before we get started, I wanted to share some housekeeping information. In 1 week, you'll receive an email with information about how to download a copy of these slides and view the webinar recording. You can also access this information directly by going to Mentor's website in the next week. And to continually improve the series, we're looking for your input. A short survey will pop up as you exit the webinar. Please take just 3 minutes to give us your feedback. We want this to be as participatory as possible, so please use the question box to ask questions throughout the webinar. Benji Server from Mentor Vermont will be queuing up questions to share with panelists during the Q&A portion at the end of the webinar. We may not get to all questions because there are several hundred of you on the webinar, but we will do our best. The questions that we share with our panelists are generally ones that broaden or deepen the conversation. And if your questions don't get answered, our panelists would love to hear from you directly. We'll provide that contact information at the end of the webinar. First, to get a sense of who is with us today, we have 2 short polls. So the first poll is, what is your experience level in the mentoring field? Are you a beginner? Are you experienced? Or are you an expert? All right, so it looks like the majority of our participants on this call are experienced, with 61% of you having been in the mentoring field for some time. We also have some beginners, 32%, welcome everyone, and 7% are experts. Excellent. Thank you so much for all of you for joining us. Our next question is, what is your role in the mentoring field? Are you a practitioner, a researcher, technical assistance provider, a funder, or other? And if you're other, please use the chat box to let us know who you are. All right, so the majority of our participants are practitioners. Excellent. So you are working in mentoring programs, and hopefully we will give you lots of tools that you can take back to those programs today. All right, so our objectives for the webinar today are to identify how strategy is used. We'll look at how it's typically understood and implemented, as well as how we should be viewing strategy to shift toward a strategy-led approach. Garner a basic framework so that you can run a strategy-led mentoring program. Examine approaches and models for developing strategy and ownership. We want to ensure you have tools to start implementing these practices today. And learn best practices and tools to operationalize strategy. Programs can come up with excellent strategic approaches, but if we don't make this a reality through day-to-day activities with resources to follow through, our strategy can fall apart. Now let's meet the people who will be a part of this webinar. I'm Audrey Cruz, and I will be your facilitator for the webinar. I've supported over 50 diverse nonprofit schools, government agencies, and companies as a management consultant and trainer. I'm currently a senior change architect with Team Tipton. Formerly the training manager with Mentor Colorado, I led statewide quality mentoring initiatives for over 60 agencies. Prior to moving to Colorado, I worked for 12 years with volunteers, youth, and families in Washington, D.C. in various capacities of nonprofit management and youth development, including a Capital Partners for Education, where today's panelist, Cary Brown, serves as CEO. I've trained people from across the country and served on numerous mentoring committees locally and nationally. I've also been a formal mentor for 7 years to an awesome young woman who is finishing up her junior year at American University. I received my MBA with specializations in business strategy and change management from the University of Colorado, Denver, a BA in English from the George Washington University, and certification in ethical leadership through the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy. And now I'd like to introduce you to our panelist, Cary Brown. Khari is the Chief Executive Officer of Capital Partners for Education, a 25-year-old nonprofit organization that mentors low-income high school and college students from the Washington, D.C. area to provide the skills and experiences they need to successfully complete college and excel in the workforce. Mr. Brown has served as CPE's Executive Director since 2001 and as its CEO since 2015. Beginning as its only employee, Mr. Brown has built CPE from a niche program that reached only 50 students per year to a burgeoning organization that is currently supporting 424 students and has grown by nearly 400% since 2012. By expanding its program offerings and leveraging the power of hundreds of trained volunteers on a daily basis, CPE has been remarkably successful in helping its students overcome the barriers that limit most low-income students. Under Mr. Brown's leadership, CPE has seen 61% of its graduates complete college on time, a rate that is more than double that of similar students nationally. Our second panelist for our webinar today is Bob Tipton. Bob is a high-energy, innovative, and insightful transformational change architect, leadership facilitator, keynote speaker, and author who is passionate about helping individuals, groups, and entire organizations reach for and achieve exceptional results. In his career to this point, he has been CEO, Principal Change Architect for RS Tipton, CEO of an IT-related professional services forum, CIO of a $1 billion distribution company, VP Managing Director for the Integrated Marketing Group for a major online agency, VP of Corporate Capabilities and Communications for a significant professional services forum, Senior Vice President of a major technology, strategy, and creative company, Global Vice President of Industry Technology for a major technology consulting firm, and CTO of a significant IT consulting company. Bob is the author of 3 books: What's Right, Not Who's Right, A Simple Shift to End the World's Madness, Jump, Get Unstuck, Extraordinary Life Breakthroughs Using Innovative Change, and Untangling IT, 25 years of lessons in effective IT leadership. Thank you both so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise with our participants. So what exactly is strategy anyway? The terms strategy and strategic are used so often at this point that it can be difficult to discern what strategy really is. For today's discussion, we'll be looking at strategy as the foundational factors that drive decision-making and program direction. Strategy is the backbone of an organization. Commonly, this consists of vision, mission, values, cultural anchors, and intentional aligned strategic priorities. Before we launch into our conversation with our panelists, let's take a moment to look at how strategy is used and how it can be used. Strategy is often developed in a top-down manner, with leadership working with each other to develop organizational strategy and then providing this information to employees and other stakeholders to varying degrees. This can lead to resistance and the inability to implement effectively, as well as misunderstanding and inefficiency. The other challenge we often see is strategy developed in siloed approaches, with a program strategy, financial strategy, marketing strategy, and so forth. each created separately. Amongst other things, this can lead to misalignment, confusion, poorly used resources, and challenging, unproductive interpersonal dynamics. To become a strategy-led organization, we want to see strategy as a lens for decision-making, inclusive of various stakeholders at all levels, the foundation for the design of all day-to-day activities, and ultimately, what all aspects of your program are aligned to. Strategy is not haphazard. It's something you can create, control, and build. With intentionality, strategy becomes the catalyst for success. You can think of this side-by-side visual of a river as two different approaches to strategy. Unintentional, unaligned strategy on the left, and intentional, inclusive strategy on the right. In the first example, energy is lost and outcomes are often unpredictable. Whereas in the second example, energy is created and outcomes are highly predictable. Looking at this in a bit more depth and specifics, intentional strategy is so beneficial to programs because it increases quality, speed, and efficacy of decision-making. It improves stakeholder outcomes. It attracts better aligned employees, board members, students, volunteers, and other stakeholders. It creates greater clarity, motivation, and momentum. And finally, it improves funding. So now that we've taken a look at how strategy is used, let's talk with our panelists about how to actually develop strategy that can guide us on our path to success. Bob, can you tell me more about how you help organizations to develop their strategy? Maybe even share with us some activities or tools that you've used?
Yeah, most definitely. Thanks, Audrey. One of the things about Team Tipton's approach is that we focus very much on a bottom-up, inside-out, participatory approach to developing strategy. It all leads to our organizational transformation. And one of the things that we definitely know is that transformation happens much more effectively when it's done through people rather than being done to people. So one of the things we start with is this notion of what is the anchor from a cultural perspective for the organization. We work primarily in the public sector. We support foundations, nonprofits is a large part of what we do. And often there's a difference of opinion when it comes to what is primary about the culture of an organization. So looking at this chart, you can see there are three light bulb looking images, and they're different colors. And there are the three primary cultural anchors that an organization can choose among. In the middle, you'll see a circle that says minimum thresholds, and an organization needs to be good enough at all three of these to be effective, but it picks one to move into the world of being primary. And the reason behind that is it shapes the strategy. It makes decision-making much more clear. So you can see some examples here of for-profit organizations and how they think about themselves. So from a product innovation perspective, Tesla comes to mind. They're a world leading, they're changing the conversation when it comes to a variety of things, battery technology and electric cars among them. And they're pushing the envelope forward. Their culture is all around the next big idea, research and development. You'll see the green culture of customer intimacy, and that's typified by Disney. They want it to be the happiest place on earth, and that is something that is integrated fully into their training, actually their hiring processes. And when it comes to rewards and recognitions for their cast members, it is clearly number one. We are focused on an experience. And then you can look at the blue, which is operational excellence. This is about streamlining and making things effective and consistent and predictable. That's typified by IKEA or Walmart, or UPS maybe is a great example. It's rare to see a UPS delivery truck in the left turn lane because it wastes time and it wastes fuel. They optimize their route, so they turn right mostly. This is a challenging conversation for many organizations to get into because you want to choose more than one of these as your cultural anchor. However, when you start driving towards one as being primary, it makes things much more clear in terms of developing strategy. So Audrey, let's move on to the next slide so we can talk specifically about developing a vision, a purpose for an organization. Now, I'd be willing to bet the organizations that you're part of started with a vision statement. They maybe started with a purpose, maybe the passion of the founder, the drive to have things move forward. And over time, that can become watered down, or it can become lost as the organization goes through leadership changes. One of the things we like to use is a scenario tool, and you can basically think of this as being storytelling. And then we like to talk about 3 stories for an organization. We start with the worst case scenario, and that's to set things free. So for the Harry Potter fans on the webinar, that's the equivalent of saying Voldemort. It doesn't mean the worst is going to show up. It's just naming the thing that is on people's minds. It lets the energy go. And then we move into the best case scenario approach, which is to drive forward into things that you might not think are possible. It's stuff that is aspirational. It's the dream kinds of things. And then we move to the most preferred scenario. And that is typified here by this picture of John Kennedy. This is from September 12th, 1962. It's his "We choose to go to the moon" speech. Clearly audacious thing to say, but so aligning about the direction that the country was heading in. And unless you're a conspiracy theorist, like some may be, on July 20th, 1969, human beings set foot on the moon. So we did something around the vision. Let's go to the next slide, Audrey. I'd like to show how this kind of works. When you're developing a purpose, when you're developing a mission, a vision, the big things that your organization stands for, we tend to get lost in flowery language. We tend to get lost in clauses and paragraphs and semicolons. Our perspective about this is to capture something that is big, and it has to follow these rules. It has to fit on a t-shirt and be readable from 20 feet. So to tell a quick story about how powerful this vision was within the NASA and the moon program in the 1960s. 1965, a group of representatives from Congress were touring the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. And one of the representatives asked someone what they were doing, what their job was. It was somebody who was sweeping in the hallway. And this person said, when asked, "What do you do here?" The person said, "I help put people on the moon." It wasn't that I'm a custodian or a janitor and I'm sweeping the floor. I'm part of something that's much larger. And that's where all of this kind of connects together. The whole purpose of building and developing strategy is to make these big ideas real. So let's move to the next slide, Audrey. Some specific tools to help shape the direction. And obviously we can talk more about this if you reach out later at the end of the webinar. But one of the most valuable tools that we've seen in making this happen, it's very visual and it's very participatory. It allows everyone in the group to be able to have their perspective included. It's called mind mapping. And the picture you see here, this is from a group we were working with in California. It happens to be a water group that we were supporting, but the vision that they had for the future, where things are going, are typified by the images that you see here. So in a mind mapping exercise, what we ask people to do is to talk about where things are going, the themes, the opportunities, the things that are shaping the future, but do that in a visual way. We don't want people to spend their time writing. We want them to actually create images. So you can see the picture here that people have created. Then we categorize them together and then we name them, and then you'll see a bunch of dots that have been put on there as well to help prioritize. The great thing about this tool is it allows everyone's voice to be included in the mix. So next slide, Audrey. The next thing that we like to use is something called the affinity diagramming process. And by the way, you can Google away on mind mapping and affinity diagramming. These are tools that have been around for decades. The great thing about the affinity diagramming process is we'll take one of these big ideas from the mind map and then we drive down into the specific aspects of that people think about as being critical, being valuable. So everyone creates a list of post-its, the things that they think are the most important. They do that in silence. Part 2 is they put them up on a flip chart in silence and they start putting them together. Without asking the other people what they mean, they start determining and discerning, they start thinking about what the other person's perspective is. And then finally, through talking in parts 3 and 4, they're able to group and then name the categories, and finally, prioritize them. So if we take a look at the next slide, Audrey, you can see what some of these things kind of pull together. So teamwork through diversity, how's that for a great strategic element for an organization? Clear pathway to learning, success and pride in a job well done. These are the categories of major strategic imperatives that then fit into a strategic plan. What we find way too often, what people do when it comes to developing strategy, is they go right into what I like to call the Home Depot dynamic. More saving, more doing. They just want to get on with the specifics of doing, and they lack the connection to the why, the big picture. So those are the kinds of things that we think about when it comes to developing strategy in the first place.
Thank you so much, Bob. Those are some great tools that our participants can use to develop their intentional strategy. Khari, what are some approaches that you've taken to developing strategy at Capital Partners for Education?
Thanks, Audrey, and thanks everyone for tuning in. As you might have heard in my introduction, I've been with CPE for 18 years, and in that time I've been through 4 strategy plans, and I've learned a lot from those. And what I'm going to share is the most recent one, which was much more successful. And I'm going to also share some honest feedback of things that really I wish I'd done differently in some of the other 3, and things I've learned along the way. A lot of the mistakes that Audrey pointed out are ones that I can actually speak to from experience. So this 5-step process really worked very well for CPE recently with our most recent strategic plan. I'll start with step 1, which is implementing the creative process. And this part is the easiest and probably the most fun. If you're entrepreneurial like I am and you love your work as I do, you spend a lot of time thinking in your spare time about ways in which you can improve the program. And so if I'm in the shower or riding my bike or alone in bed at night and coming up with ideas and then having someone who you can bounce those ideas off of is really helpful. And Audrey was one of those people when she was at CPE, and we spent a lot of time saying, well, what if we did it this way, and could we get better results for our students? And Audrey might say, well, that's great, but what if in addition we did this? And then taking what you have as a basic idea, testing it against what the research might say, and seeing if you have enough to move forward. If you do have enough to move forward, you move to step 2, which would be identifying a message. And this is really where you're testing your theory. You're taking it out to the public. And it's an opportunity to practice your pitch and also listen and get feedback from people. And you can take that feedback and begin to make adjustments to both your message and the model. This is just a one-on-one process, and rinse and repeat. Do it, as many times until you feel like you have enough to take it out now to a wider set of stakeholders. And then at step 3, getting buy-in, this is where you're going to those really important stakeholders. So for us, it's our donors, our board members, and here it's really important that you not only have the right message, but that you have facts to back it up, right? And anytime you're asking people to consider changing something, they may be a little resistant, and so you have to have made a strong case, and don't try to do it all at once. You move people a little bit, and then if you can get them on your side, it's really, really important to be able to develop advocates who can then work with you on getting others to also buy into what it is that you're proposing in terms of the new strategy. And then as we move to step 4, is a theory of change. And this is something that I really wish that I had understood and applied earlier, and something that worked very, very well for us most recently in 2016 as we were beginning a new strategy process. and bringing in a third party who can help you and be independent, bring everyone together. In our case, we were proposing a new strategy for our mentoring program when we wanted to bring in top research scientists who could help apply some of the best practices and also help our entire organization go through the process of considering and redesigning. And so we put we got a giant boardroom, our entire staff, the majority of our board. We did it over 4 days, and we sort of sequestered ourselves, and we said we're going to have no silent disagreement. This is really that bottom-up approach that was mentioned before, and something that I missed the first time around. And getting the input, particularly of the people who are going to be asked to execute what you eventually roll out, and that worked very, very well for us. It's time-consuming, it's difficult, but it is really worth the while. And it's, I would recommend for those practitioners out there that if you're thinking about doing this in advance, to go and try and get funding to cover the costs of bringing someone in to help you with this. And it helps really validate and help you make sure that you have the right decisions in the right format to move to the next step. And then in step 5 is really tying it all together here. And so as you come out of that last process, you have a roadmap, but you still have a lot of decisions to make. And we called that roadmap our blueprint. And we knew that the decisions that we were going to have to make had real resource allocation implications. And we knew we had to come up with a new mission statement. It's a long process, and it's a bit of a political process that be involving a lot of people. And what we ended up doing was, for the key decisions, we again wanted to bring in some outside experts to help us present all of the facts and then make recommendations to our board. And so after we did that, came up with a new mission statement, and then a final step and this took extra time, but we piloted the new program model. And once we had enough that we were satisfied with, we ended up bringing in another set of independent strategy consultants to help us finalize a 3-year plan and a revenue model to match it, so we could move ahead and begin executing. So altogether, an 18-month process, but one that really set us up for success. And we're now in the process of expanding by 75% over 3 years, and we're a little over a year in, and things are going great. So I'm much more pleased with this process, and would happy to share any thoughts with others if they have questions later on.
Thank you so much for providing that information, Khari. I think it's great that you kind of went through this over an 18-month process. I think that helps people to understand kind of the timeline of what this can really look like. And as we talked about earlier, as Bob kind of mentioned, some people try to barrel through it and get to the doing. And so I think it's great that you can provide kind of an example of how that length of time really helped the organization to embed this across the board. And also, I love that you revisited the mission statement. I think that a lot of times as organizations, we tend to feel that those mission and vision statements are unchangeable. And so I think it's really wonderful that you provided an example of how you revisited that and altered it to help to fit the current strategy and movement into the future for your organization. Seems like a really great, straightforward 5-step process as well that our webinar participants can use. So thank you so much for sharing that. And Khari and Bob, you've both described processes for developing strategy in organizations that are inclusive of various stakeholders, which brings us to a very important point in successful strategy: ownership. Bob, can you start us off and tell us, in your experience, why is stakeholder ownership important to the success of organizational strategy?
Well, it's a pretty simple answer, Audrey. People support what they create. In fact, maybe to say it even more plainly, people only support what they create. The typical approach to developing strategy is that people come to places like here in Colorado where I live. They go to, who knows, Beaver Creek or Vail or Keystone someplace, and 6 or 8 people around the table, they decide all the big things for the organization. And they come back and they hand it to the rest of the organization and say, here, this is what we came up with, make it happen. And then they wonder why, months later, nothing really has changed. It's because there's no ownership in it for the people that actually have to live with it. If I've learned nothing else in the world of working in transformational change over the years, is people really don't resist change, but they resist being changed without their participation, without their permission, without their investment. So this notion of organizational energy around change, we put together this scale years ago, and we use it to remind ourselves that there are different kinds of energy when it comes to driving ownership around change, around strategy implementation. And again, strategy, the only reason for it is to make something happen. It isn't just the goal of creating a strategic plan. Many organizations look at that as the end point. That's actually the end of the beginning, is when you build your plan. It's making it real. So this scale that we put together, you can see in the right, there are ovals that say change is almost guaranteed to fail or change is almost guaranteed to succeed. And you can decide what energy you're bringing to the overall effort. At the bottom is shame. It's amazing, back when the economy was so bad in 2008, 2009, 2010, people were just being told regularly, just be glad you have this job. What a wonderful way to motivate people to be able to bring their best to the situation is to shame them into performing better. Threats and coercion are next on the list. They're not much better, but some organizations actually think that wagging their finger at their employees is a way to get things to move. Then you can see our bias around performance management systems. I speak a lot. I talk to a lot of groups around the world every year, and I've asked this question many, many times. How many people in the audience have had their performance at work significantly improved through the performance management system that their organization employs? I have yet to have a single person raise their hand and say that it has. Performance management systems are a backstop for the poorest performing employees in an organization, but they're not designed to actually create transformation or ownership and strategy. And then maybe Khari and I have a little bit different definition of the term buy-in. I'll tell you how I think about buy-in. Buy-in is a warming kind of feeling. It makes you feel good about what's going on, but it isn't enough, in my opinion, for us to actually overcome the fight or flight feelings that we have inside of our brains. Our low-level brain response to change often is to either run away from it or to fight back against it. Buy-in isn't powerful enough energy to actually transform the way that we think about things. And then impersonal surveys, I don't know about you, raise your hand if you're tired of being surveyed. We get asked our opinion about things so frequently that many people just look at surveys as kind of a perfunctory step, and it's a, oh well. It doesn't change either the level of ownership when it comes to things. There's a line that we have somewhere between 55 and 70% on this scale where change starts to become likely to succeed. And that's when we intentionally include people. We've talked a couple of times now about a bottom-up approach. Many leaders want nothing to do with that because they think it wastes time. We're so addicted to certainty, and we're so impatient in our culture. The last thing people want to do is to invite people what their opinion might be. Okay, don't do that up front, and you'll be facing all the issues down the road about having to try to get people to participate. Include them right off the bat. And if you go to significant participation, here we're talking about the entire organization, having them have a role to play. It's not a democracy, one person, one vote kind of thing when it comes to how the organization is moving, but give them the opportunity to shape the strategy. Present to them a 90 or 95% complete view of something and say, what do you think? And then finally, if you get to full ownership, it's likely, in fact, it's almost guaranteed that the change will succeed. So we're pretty clear about this energy level. It's important to drive ownership, and then you have the best chance possible for the strategy that you're building to actually become real. So you move away from being a strategic planning-based organization to being a strategy-led organization. So that's what I think about, Audrey.
Thank you, Bob. That's a great understanding of kind of that scale of ownership and helping our participants to understand where we want to be on that scale. Since stakeholder ownership is so important in moving strategy forward, Bob, do you have any tips for how organizations can develop this ownership?
Yeah, well, you start first of all with building a culture around it. So from an onboarding, even a recruiting perspective, one of the things that you ask in the process of bringing people in is to say, you know, we have a participatory culture here. We ask people their opinion. We want them to be part of this process. You know, I go back to working for Disney. We were a consultant to Disney, and we had to go through their new employee orientation process. And day 2 of the new employee orientation process, the title of it was, it was never on any slide, but this is how it's referred to. This is the happiest place on earth, or else. It's this notion that there is no second choice. We will have people be brought forward in it. And then we talk about our common understanding of language and guiding principles and foundational elements, the things that we stand for. This notion of having people own it right from the day that they start inside the organization. And then it goes through the process of reviews and understanding how people are doing. You reward people based upon a connection to the strategy and how it's being delivered. We have people learn it, live it, put their fingerprints on it, continue to refine it. And I love what Khari talked about when you revisit your mission and your vision. That's not a static thing. It's something that's influenced by what's happening in the world. But you're constantly asking people to be part of that as they move forward. And then the last major piece of this is something we ask when new leaders come into an organization. Could be a new executive director, it could be a new leader of development, you know, who knows, in the organization. But have them develop their manifesto, their thoughts about what it means to be a strategy-led organization. Have them put that together when they begin, and then socialize it throughout the organization. It gives people comfort to know that the new leader coming in understands the strategic imperatives, they understand the culture of the organization, and they've internalized it to say, this is what you can expect from me as we move forward. So there's a quick list. You can also capture some of this in videos and in white papers and things on your intranet to be able to have people see it, but be intentional about it and do it from end to end. That's how we think about that, Audrey.
Thank you for those tips, Bob. Khari, you provided a pretty robust example of how Capital Partners for Education developed ownership when creating this most recent theory of change and strategic plan. What are some other ways you help stakeholders to develop ownership of the organizational strategy, especially when people aren't involved in creating it?
Thanks, Audrey. Yeah. I guess I would like to share, about working with 2 different constituencies, a board of directors and staff. And the approach, well, there'll be similarities between each. There were also some differences. And I'll start with the board. Again, the board members are used to analyzing data and using it to inform strategy. And so it's really important, again, to make sure that as you are presenting something that is going to take the organization perhaps in a different direction, they may not know very much about it, you have to lead with the facts. And I found that always, even if someone might be initially resistant to some of the ideas that you're proposing, that if you present a case, a good business case, then that can be very compelling to them. And one of the things that I found that helps to get people to have a little bit more ownership of it is when I'm not telling them, completely, this is what I think we should do. Present a case, and it's not entirely fully baked, and saying, what do you think? And letting them come to the conclusions. And often, if you've built the case in the right way, they're going to get to the same place, where you are, but they feel like this is something, as you're discussing it, that we've come up with together. And now, you have an ally, and I talked about this a little bit before. You take those allies, and it's helpful in going on to the next one. And particularly when you're presenting things now back in the group, I talked about the importance of doing this one-on-one. Now, when you're back in the group, and I hope there aren't any CPE board members on this webinar, but I've over 18 years learned how to work with my board in particular, and I know which people are going to be most influential in helping to influence others. And so developing a couple of those allies and having them help make the case, rather than having the single leader being out front and driving all of the change. And then with the staff, it's going to, some of the same principles will apply, but of course this is their full-time job. They have a different stake in it, and in our case, the staff are really going to want to understand, is this going to be good for me? And with our really mission-oriented staff, they're going to be very concerned about, is this going to be good for our students, for my students? And again, as you present the case and talk it through, and giving them time to add their feedback, and being inclusive of that. And if you have enough people who are offering, consistent feedback on something that you want to bring to the group, and then it's a good thing to constantly revisit and be able to make adjustments. So I found that those two ways, those are ways to work with each of those two groups that I work with often.
Great, thank you, Khari. So even when we develop intentional strategy and get stakeholders involved and invested, we can still fall flat if we don't take it from kind of those theories and ideas to everyday activities at all levels. So let's take a look at how we can operationalize the strategy that's been created so that your program stakeholders can live and breathe it in alignment. Bob, what recommendations do you have for how to make strategy a reality? How can organizations operationalize their strategy?
So capitalizing on the stuff that we've already talked about, there's intentional participation in creating it in the first place. That helps with a lot of the change management kinds of stuff, that the resistance that comes up later on. But there's three kind of simple steps that are important to look at here. First, if you haven't attached resources, and that's people, process, tools, to something, it isn't actually something that you can do. One of the things we find often in the strategy approaches that organizations take is they just wish or hope. They don't attach actual resources to something. Instead, it's, we'll figure it out as we go. Well, that's a hope. That's not strategy. And as such, you need to attach some specific resource to it. And point 3 on here, in fact, when you're in a resource-constrained organization, that may mean requiring a trade-off. We're going to stop doing something else so that we can do this because we are constrained. Or, as Khari has mentioned, maybe the right thing to do is to bring in outside resources to help you to be able to develop and implement the things that you're looking for. And as I talked about before at the organizational change energy scale, give it a chance to be successful. Some of the things that happen in the world of organizational life is we wander around a little bit. Sometimes we go up and down, and it may not seem like we're actually getting there. Don't cut it off too soon. Give it a chance to be successful. Often strategy is a little bit like having a plant come out of the ground. It needs to be cared for, and it needs to be nurtured. So those are the things to think about. Some specific things, we go to the next slide. If we need to be making trade-offs between one thing or another, I want to share, I'm a consultant, don't hold that against me, but as a consultant, I tend to think in 2x2 models, and this is one that we use with our clients to help them make a decision between two choices or more about what to do. So the x-axis at the bottom has to do with the value to the organization of whatever the thing is, from low to high, and then what you'll see on the left and the y-axis is your ability to execute. So that's your ability to actually get things done. So the things that are high value and the things that you're good at, those are in category A. Keep doing those things. Make sure they're in your strategy. Make sure you're operationalizing and adding resources to those things on a regular basis. The things that are high organizational value, but you aren't very good or you have some challenges in terms of execute, that's where you have opportunities for strategic investment. So that's learning, that's additional tools, that's bringing in outside experts. Those are things to consciously think about when it comes to what we're investing in. If it's low organizational value, but you're good at it, those are some things that you might think about stopping. It doesn't actually move the story forward. And when you think about editing a movie, an editor of a movie isn't concerned about the quality of the acting or the power of the special effects. What the editor is concerned about is this moving the story forward, yes or no? And that's where you can get into some hard decisions, because some people may have invented or created something years ago that just isn't all that relevant anymore. And then finally, the stuff that's low value, you're not good at it, pull the ripcord. Don't do those at all. So the things that fit in the D category, just stop. So let me get into a little bit more granular view of building an implementation plan. So the next slide helps us get into the pieces of a plan to be able to make implementation real. So we have steps, we have stages, we have to make sure that we have accountability in the whole process, that roles and responsibilities are very clear, and then it needs to be managed appropriately and effectively so that we know what we're doing. So let's take a look at building the components of an implementation plan, and I use a metaphor for this. So let's flip to the next page, please. The metaphor is based upon something called a work breakdown structure. So for those of you that are familiar with project management, this is basically project management 101. We take something that we're doing and we break it down into its component pieces. So here you see a project at the top where it's got a purpose, and then we have different work streams that are included in that. We have A and we have B, and then we have categories of work for A and B in the work stream, and then finally we have individual tasks. So we want to think about this a little bit like building a Frankenstein monster. We want to make sure we have all the pieces at the bottom in terms of tasks, so that if we assemble them, we can actually have a Frankenstein monster. We can have all the pieces that we need. So this little abstract, let me put it into a more practical view, and that's the metaphor that I use. So flip to the next page, please. Many of us have cars. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that most of us do. Maybe that's a changing dynamic as we move along, but most of us at some point in our life will or have purchased a car. If we break it down into its component pieces, this is what a work breakdown structure looks like for that particular thing that we do. We don't necessarily think about all these pieces, but when we're doing implementation planning, we need to think to this level of granularity. So the stuff in green is we're doing our criteria assessment and establishing our criteria and market assessment. All these pieces and parts go into the decision about buying a car. The blue boxes talk about the actual process of going to look at one, test driving, deciding where we're going to buy it, and then finally the pink is where we are buying it and getting insurance for it. So this is the steps and stages, but it's not the implementation plan. So the next slide will show us how we will sequence things. We take the individual work tasks and we put them into an order. So when we have the individual work, we know what needs to be done. And if we move to the next slide, we can see specifically how that applies to buying a car. So typically, most people, well, at least the people that I know, maybe that's different for all of you, but most people choose cars first from an emotional perspective. What brand they have, maybe that's something that's been built into your consciousness from your childhood. Whether you want an electric car, whether you want to have something that can tow your boat. That's when we start getting into the space and technical needs, and then we establish the budget. So we tend to flow it this way. When we look at building implementation plans, we're pretty clear that it's important to know exactly the steps, the stages, the roles, the responsibilities, and then the actual flow of how to get the work done. So those are some tools that can help you when it comes to actually building an implementation plan to allow you to operationalize your strategy.
Thank you, Bob. That's very helpful information for how programs can make strategy a reality. I love a good work breakdown structure. Khari, what is the biggest challenge you've faced in operationalizing strategy and creating a strategy-led organization?
Well, the hardest part is then after you've done all of the work of the strategy is executing it, and running into the change management of that has always been, the first part is theory and the second part is practice, right? And the change is very, very hard. But, I want to be very clear that the change is also really necessary. And so my organization, CPE, we just celebrated our 25th year, and we are very, very different today from what we used to be. And people who might have known us back then, if they'd gone away and come back, they wouldn't recognize what we look like now. And so I would argue that change is really necessary. If you don't change, as an organization, you will die. And Bob mentioned the hard times of 2008, 2009, 2010. A lot of the leading organizations in our space in DC at that time have since gone out of business. And CP has really been able to adapt. And so I would urge everyone to not run away just because from the idea of changing, just because it is difficult, and pay attention to the things that in your marketplace, and be ready to confront it. Now, once you do, you know that you will encounter some level of resistance, even if you do everything right. And so I'm going to credit myself in advance. I think we did a lot of things right with that approach that I described. But even still, with that bottom-up approach, I just share an example of one of the people who, through our theory of change process, was suggesting that we make a fundamental change that would actually lead to us ending the program that she was involved with. And then a couple of months later, when we actually went about to do it, she spoke up and said, "I can't believe that we're doing this." And I said, "Well, this was actually your idea, and and for all of these reasons." And I think she was having second thoughts, or emotional about what that actual change would mean for her and for the students who would be going through. So even with the most sound rationale, you still sometimes run into resistance. And so one of the things that I have found in dealing with that is you just cannot stress enough how important it is to over communicate and be consistent about the reasons why you are doing things, why it is going to be better this way. I know we haven't done it yet, but we are going to do these things, and this is the reason why. I have 2 kids, and so I'm used to explaining things over and over again now. And while I think my staff's a little bit more polite than 10-year-old who rolls her eyes every time I say the same thing over and over again, I think what I've learned is that it is better to risk people feeling bored that they're hearing the same thing yet again, but to have everyone understand the rationale behind the decisions and be able to have a discussion about it. And then, of course, you can do everything right, or think that you do everything right, and there can be some unexpected events. Again, things like 2008 with the financial crisis, or things that you just didn't account for, you didn't see. In the strategic plan that we began in 2012 and completed in 2013, one of the foundational elements was adopting a new technology, and we probably didn't demo the technology enough, and there were some things that we missed, and it ended up being a failure. And Audrey may remember some of this, and it took a while to dig our way out of it, but I return to the phrase that my college basketball coach said time and again when we faced hard times. He'd say, "Don't panic, adjust, and here's what we're going to do. And we had to come up with a new plan of action, involving everyone's input on the team, and thinking about how are we going to deal with this. We have to scrap the technology. It's going to cause the following problems, and what is our plan to deal with them? And you just have to be able to adjust for the things that you might not have been able to predict in advance.
Thank you so much, Khari, for sharing some of those challenges. I do remember some of the technology mishaps that we had. And I absolutely agree. Communication, consistency, transparency, and rationale, they're so key to moving this forward and helping to overcome some of those challenges that even when everything is done correctly and people have that ownership, these challenges can still occur. And
you
Bob,
might want to
what
forget,
would you say? You might want to forget, yes. And Bob, what would you say are the biggest challenges that you encounter to operationalizing strategy and developing strategy-led organizations?
Well, I'm going to camp on something that Khari brought up. And that has to do with, what do you do when you find yourself in a hole? The first thing to do when you find yourself in a hole is stop digging the hole. Sometimes the momentum in an organization needs to stop going in a certain direction because it doesn't make sense. And I don't think people are willing to stand up and say, hold on here, we're not going in the right direction soon enough. So having enough trust in the organization, there's this notion of fear that somehow if you bring the idea forward, you'll be criticized for it, or worse yet, you'll be blamed for it. Organizations need to have enough trust present so that they can speak freely. They can talk about things that need to be discussed. I mean, there's a story here from Colorado. It's called Miracle Mike. For those of you that want to go and Google something while you're hearing me talk, look up Miracle Mike in Fruita, Colorado. Well, the story goes this way, and it was documented in Life magazine in the 1940s. It was about Mike, who was a rooster. He was being prepared for dinner. That's what his job was. And they removed his head like they do, but they left enough of his medulla there that he actually kept on living. And the rooster lived for 18 months without his head. He'd just run around the barnyard and people put food and water down his neck. Well, it's kind of a gruesome image, but why would you do that? Why would you continue to put food and water down the neck of something that's lost its head? Well, that's what happens in project life and organizational life all the time, is we just keep doing things because we're afraid not to. The other aspect that I see frequently in organizations is the biggest, competitor to operationalizing strategy is complacency. I waited out the last executive director. I'll wait you out too. I've waited out the last group. I'll just wait this out as well. I don't have to do anything. You can't make me. This notion that somehow just perpetuating the status quo is fine and not doing anything. And another thing that we find frequently too, and this is another fear-based response that shows up in this full-time know-it-all. The people that just simply have it all figured out. They remember everything the organization's ever done that has failed, and that can never be done again. In fact, that's one of the areas where we look at some opportunities to try something again. Maybe the time wasn't right. Maybe the resources weren't right. Maybe it was a great idea that wasn't nurtured effectively and it didn't succeed that way. But the people that have this full-time know-it-all kind of mentality, they can't bring a beginner's attitude to something. They can't just simply learn and explore. Well, I think everyone can agree that the world is never going to be more simple than it is right now. The complexity of where the world is heading is going to continue to grow. And our ability to reach and respond and come up with solutions that are going to make a difference in an ever more complex world means sometimes we just have to put away our belief that we know it all. So those are some areas, Audrey, that we run across all the time. Get over yourself, and it kind of comes to the book that I wrote recently called What's Right, Not Who's Right. If we can focus on what's right and get away from the debate and the discussion and the dysfunction around who's right, everything changes.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all of this information that both of you have provided about running strategy-led mentoring programs and organizations. I'd love to spend the rest of our time talking with you both through some Q&A. Benji, do you have some audience questions for us?
I do. Thank you, Audrey. The first question I have here is, many mentoring organizations operate with a very small staff and budget. What are some recommendations that you both would offer for finding time to plan and implement organizational change with very limited staffing and resources?
Well, I'm happy to field this one because I've done it with 8-person staff, and I've mentioned consultants a few times. I'll preface this by saying, and apologies to Bob and Audrey who are consultants, the consultants are, it can be time consuming to work with consultants and difficult at times, but I would advise everyone who is small to try to find more resources. And if you can't pay for them, I know it's frustrating that often donors don't want to pay for these types of things, but you can, if you look hard enough, you can find a donor who is willing to cover the cost, and try to do that in advance to be able to bring in a third party who can help you present some of the tough questions, to validate what you are hearing, to offer feedback, and to help steer things along. And particularly when you are presenting things that are going to involve change, they can, having that third party, sort of an unbiased view, can be very, very helpful to those who are on the operations side.
Yeah, let me thank you for that. I'm going to add a little bit of a perspective, and thank you for the plug to bring in a consultant from time to time. We really do earn our money at times. The perspective I want to go to is a little bit more on how we manage with time during the day. Obviously we have exactly the same amount of time, each of us, and there's a technique that I tried years ago that really helped me, not only from an organizational viewpoint, but also from a personal viewpoint. And that is to take the word busy and eliminate it from your vocabulary. Take the word busy and don't use it. Well, the experiment that I tried was this. I think people tend to use the word busy in one of two ways, and sometimes both ways, neither one of which is empowering. The first one is either as a shield. I'm busy, stay away. I can't talk to you right now. I've got too many things going on. And what it does is it effectively deflects things that might come into our consciousness or awareness, or things that are important, like strategy, like planning, like intentionally disrupting our day so that we can do things in a different way. So don't use it as a shield. The other thing that people tend to use busy is as a badge of honor. Look at me, I'm busy. I've got a whole lot of stuff happening in my world, and therefore I'm to be revered. It's almost in our culture, if you're not busy, then there's something wrong with you. So here's what I tried. Try it for the next 24 hours. Take the word busy out of your vocabulary. When somebody says, "How are you doing?" don't say busy. When somebody says, "What's going on in your world?" don't say, "I'm having a really busy day." Instead say, "I'm intentionally doing things today that have value and have meaning. I am productive today. I have a full schedule today of things that I find valuable." It's amazing what happens in your schedule when you stop thinking about being busy. Just try it for 24 hours. And then all the advice that Khari gave you about setting time aside and bringing in experts and getting help, it starts to have a place where it can actually start growing. If you leave room, if you make room in your schedule for a different approach. So not minimizing the need to do things and wear many hats and have a very, very full schedule during the day. But when you think about your time differently and quit using the word busy, things shift.
Great, thank you. I have another question now from somebody who runs a mentoring program working with a variety of stakeholders. So the question is, I work in a school-based mentoring program that requires cooperation with teachers, social workers, and school staff who might not be directly connected with the program. What are some recommendations for implementing change when there are so many involved who view their participation as a lower priority?
Let me take that and start with that one, Khari. We work with the school district currently right now here in the Denver metro area. The school district's in serious trouble, and they're the first one in the state of Colorado ever to be put on a corrective action by the State Board of Education. And one of the things that was most significantly missing in the school district's ability to be successful was collaboration among various stakeholder groups. Sometimes what's necessary to help people understand that collaboration is an important thing is to play out scenarios to their logical conclusions. So talk about insights and implications. If we don't have a higher level of collaboration among our various stakeholders, this is what's likely to occur. And we can talk about things like graduation rates, and we have a poor connection to post-secondary opportunities for kids. There's nowhere for them to go. We have a myopic focus specifically on college readiness, and we ignore the kids that would be more successful and more satisfied by going into a career. There's a lot of benefit in talking through the potential implications associated with either deciding to do something or not do something. So one of the things that we see very clearly when it comes to getting people aligned around something is to focus on a common interest. In the case of a school district, in the case of this particular school district, they want to have a healthy community, they want to have a healthy school district, and they want to be able to bring the two together in such a way that it makes a difference well into the future. So that's a couple of things to think about there.
I'd just add something really briefly. I really liked Bob's example of the rooster with its head cut off and people trying to keep feeding it. I've felt that way. My team has felt that way in working with some school partners over the years. And sometimes, Bob said, like, they just, it's not going to work. If you can, and keep forcing the foods down its neck. Sometimes you have to just pull back and say, can this really happen? If you try Bob's approach and it doesn't work, like, be ready to say, okay, we have to do something different.
And Benji, I think we might have time for just one more question.
Okay, great. And this question goes to both you, Bob and Khari. What key tips do you have that would be applicable specifically to mentoring programs who are interested in becoming strategy-led organizations?
Well, I'm going to maybe defer to Khari when it comes specifically to mentoring-based organizations. I have some obvious tips when it comes to any organization, but Khari, what would you say for a mentoring organization specifically?
Well, I think we've offered a lot of general things. I would say for the person who asked the question, if they had real specific questions dependent upon their own situation, I'd be happy to talk with them offline. But I think taking a step back, taking the time to, generally speaking, taking a step back, taking the time to assess, and do you have something new that you want to advance? It really depends upon where exactly, the point from which you're starting. So sorry, I can't be more specific than that right now.
Yeah, so let me give kind of a general answer, and it speaks a little bit to the whole nature of mentoring. I think mentoring is about helping others see a path that maybe they aren't able to see on their own, to set a direction, to continue to take the steps and be able to move in a way that is making sense. It's looking to outside viewpoints and learning. I just suggest that maybe taking the things that each of the mentoring organization is providing and allowing yourself to have the same thing happen to you. As a consultant, sometimes I have to remember I need to have a partner outside that is helping me keep my saw sharpened, to use a Stephen Coveyism. And this notion about becoming strategy-led means that maybe some of the ways that we have been operating our own organizations could benefit from some new thinking, some new approaches, some mentoring from the outside. So as we like to talk about inside of Team Tipton on a regular basis, we need to eat our own cooking. In other words, we need to do the same things internally that we're asking our clients to do externally. So that may be something I might recommend, Khari, to the mentoring organizations, is eat your own cooking every now and then. It's a good thing to do.
Yeah, I like that.
Thank you so much, Khari and Bob, for providing our participants with great information and tools to tackle inclusive and sustainable strategy for mentoring programs and organizations across the country. Our panelists are excited to make themselves available for you beyond today's webinar. Participants, if you have additional questions or would like to learn more about our panelists' work, please feel free to contact our panelists or me directly. Mentor scales impact by developing and supporting a national network of affiliates. These affiliates provide the leadership and infrastructure necessary to support the expansion of quality mentoring relationships in local communities or statewide. Mentor affiliates also serve a unique role as a clearinghouse for training, resources, public awareness, and advocacy. We encourage you to find out whether you have an affiliate in your region and connect with them to learn about local resources and training opportunities. Additionally, we encourage you to register your program with the Mentoring Connector, a national database of mentoring programs. This zip code searchable database allows mentors and mentees from across the country to find your program and is connected to LinkedIn, NBA Cares, Mentor.gov, and so many other avenues of free program promotion. Finally, check out the OJJDP National Mentoring Resource Center website for no-cost mentoring resources to help you apply evidence-based mentoring practices to your program. The OJJDP NMRC provides evidence reviews on mentoring models and mentoring for special populations, implementation resources from training manuals to mentor guides, reviewed by the NMRC Research Board, a blog featuring innovations and best practices for mentoring practitioners, and the opportunity to request no-cost training or technical assistance. As a reminder, 1 week after the webinar, all attendees will receive an email with a link to the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series page, where we will post the recording, slides, and additional resources. Also, don't forget, we really want your feedback. At the end of today's webinar, please answer the short survey and help us make this series even better. Be sure to visit the Collaborative Mentoring Webinar Series page on the Mentor website for an archive of all past webinars and information about upcoming webinars. Thank you again to everyone for joining us today, especially our panelists. And Benji, thank you for queuing up those great questions. Please join us next month for our next webinar on mentoring youth impacted by opioids. I hope everyone has an excellent day.
Thank you.